Hello, this is укрлайф TV, and we continue our broadcasting from Kiev. And today our guest is very famous Austrian military analyst who is specializing in history of military aviation. This is Tom Cooper. And Mr. Cooper, thank you very much for agreement to be with us today.
You're most welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper, let's start from the general situation on the battlefield. What is your understanding of situation?
Well, generally, both sides are at standstill. The Russian winter offensive ended nowhere, or actually almost where it began. It was stopped in Crimea area. It was stopped in Siversk area. Russians are still advancing inside Bakhmut, and they were short of capturing 90% of what is left of the town, or the ruins of Bakhmut. But last 3 days, Ukrainian forces over there have run a local counteroffensive and seems to have reversed some of Russian advances. Then we have the situation in Avdiivka, where the Russian did manage a few gains and advance for something like 500 meters, perhaps 1,000 meters in the south of Avdiivka, and about 2 kilometers north of Avdiivka, but didn't manage to cut off the garrison of Avdiivka from its supply line. In Marinka, the Russians did manage to capture most of the also ruined town or village, as ever you like it, and they have pushed the Ukrainians all the way to the eastern side of the place, but they are so exhausted they cannot advance. In the south, the Ukrainians have thrown the Russians entirely, or almost entirely, back to their starting lines of the winter offensive back in mid-January in the Vuhleda area, and have regained some villages further west in Orikhiv area. So right now the terrain is still largely muddy and wet, and the NATO side has ability to really run big mechanized operations, and the Russians are out of conditions to do so alone because they simply have lost so many tanks and armored fighting vehicles, which means they simply cannot continue. Moreover, their situation is such that they are trying to keep the front line occupied by relatively thin shield of forces, thin line of forces, and to build up reserves in the rear for the case of a Ukrainian counteroffensive. So now each side is, so to say, waiting what is going to happen as next.
If we discuss a future counteroffensive, now it is clear that Russia have prepared 3 lines of defense with trenches, bunkers, and minefields. And if we could imagine what could happen, we understand that maybe it is impossible to make something like Desert Storm style operation, and in that case, what it could be, slow frontal pushes. But if it looks like, slow frontal pushes, that sounds like a lot of casualties.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you cannot expect either desert-style operation with some kind of sweeping mechanized maneuver by Ukrainian army, because it simply does not have the force for that. It does not have 1,000 tanks to deploy in such a huge operation. It does not have aerial superiority. It does not have superiority in artillery. Ukraine cannot run such an operation. On the other side, the terrain is entirely different, because Ukraine is not a flat semi-desert like Kuwait, like Western Kuwait or southern Iraq. Excuse me. And finally, there is still a strong Russian air force. There is still a strong Russian artillery. So what we do have to expect are a different kind of operations in which, let me get back to one step back. the Russian front line, you said it consists of 3 lines. In some places it consists even of 3 or 4 or 5 lines. And I mean 4 or 5 lines of trenches. And most of these trenches are protected by minefields, by deep minefields. Some of minefields are 2 to 10 kilometers deep, which means there are millions of mines over there in front of that front line. So the purpose of such front lines is to slow down, to stop any kind of Ukrainian attempt to penetrate the front line, to breach through it, and to then, in order to enable the Russian artillery and airstrikes to hit the Ukrainian force, which is attacking. This, in other words, means that Ukrainians have to search for areas which are not as well protected, whether by minefields or by the Russian forces entrenched behind the minefields, or they have to concentrate a huge volume, huge number of troops in a relatively small area, support them by engineering equipment, and then try to breach the front line per force in the course of a battle of attrition. We've seen what happens when Ukraine tries to do that last year in September in central northern Kherson, where the Ukrainians have repeatedly breached the Russian front lines, but every time they would drive through, Russians would subject them to severe artillery strikes and airstrikes, and there were heavy casualties on the Ukrainian side. Of course, there were heavy casualties on the Russian side as well, but it was not enough to effect a permanent situation, a permanent penetration where Ukrainian forces would really drive 20, 30, 40, 50 kilometers behind Russian front lines and be able of remaining there. They would every time drive 10 kilometers, 15, perhaps 20, but then would be subjected to so much artillery fire and so many airstrikes that they had to withdraw. And this is what Ukraine is going to search to avoid. On the other hand, we have to expect the Russians to try to avoid a situation, like in September last year, where they have sent all of their reinforcements to Kherson, and Ukrainians then attacked in eastern Kharkiv instead, so to say. So what happened then? The Russian front line in southeastern Kharkiv was poorly occupied, and once the Ukrainians penetrated this front line, what happened then was that there were no Russians behind the front line, so the Ukrainians drove 70 kilometers deep, eventually all the way to Kupiansk, and almost encircled the 1st Guards Tanks Army in the Izium area. And the situation resulted with the collapse of the Russian front line and eventually a withdrawal from eastern Kharkiv. So we have to expect the Ukrainians to search for this later solution, but the Russians to search for ways to prevent such a situation from happening. And this is why nowadays the Russian front line is not held by lots of troops. It's a thin line, there are thick deep minefields, but relatively few troops behind it. What is different to last year, however, is that Russians have big concentrations of mechanized forces deeper behind the front line. So if Ukrainians drive through their front line again, they have a reserve force which is there to intervene and to hit back on the advancing Ukrainian troops. This is the difference in the situation. This is what is most likely outcome of any kind of current operation, and where Ukraine has a major problem right now. Ukraine needs not only artillery to actually penetrate or breach the Russian front line, but it also needs enough artillery, and with artillery I mean also long-range artillery rockets, such like HIMARS, like MRLS, and similar weapons, range of 70, 80, 100, 120, 130 kilometers, in order to hit these Russian reserves behind the front line. Moreover, it has to hit them in sufficient with sufficient force, which means not just, let's say, 6 HIMARS or 12 HIMARS a day, but 120, 200 HIMARS a day. It also has to simultaneously hit Russian artillery and supply depots, which we are already talking about 300, 400 HIMARS a day. Right now, Ukraine does not have this ammunition for this. Similarly, it does not have enough 155mm artillery shells in order to run such an operation. So actually, we are all waiting for Ukraine to get all of this ammunition it needs for such an operation. That is one side. And the other side, we are waiting for the weather to stabilize, for the soil to dry out, so that nobody would become bogged down in the mud, like this would happen right now. The weather in Kiev is meanwhile nice, but in the east it's not that nice. It's still not that nice. It's something like 15 degrees. There are frequent showers. The soil is muddy, and it's not possible to run such operations.
If we look for the Russian troops, yeah, and what you say, does it mean that Russia is much more ready for Ukrainian counteroffensive than, for example, last year, and it used another, tactic or another strategy, as I understand, yeah, from your words?
Yes, you are right. Russians have been given more than a year of time to adapt to this war, to learn their lessons, and they're slowly learning these lessons, and they're adapting. In order, for example, we have seen this winter, in order to continue their advance, they have reorganized their entire army, and the way this army is operating, from mechanized formations into heavy infantry formations, custom tailored for assaults in the urban areas, and we are seeing the results of this, especially in Bakhmut area, less so in Vuhledar and Avdiivka. But they are adapting, they are learning. They're slow in doing so, but they do. And these are decisions which have no impact upon Putin or his system, and those he's letting the commanders do as they're learning their lessons. And he says, okay, this is fine, let's do that. On the other side, they have learned that lesson from the last year, and they have applied corresponding solutions, which means they have created these big groups of reserve forces behind the front line. For example, in the north, behind the Crimea area, there is again the 1st Guards Tanks Army, which is largely free, which is sitting there 5, 10, 15, 20 kilometers behind the front line, depending what area and what unit, and waiting for Ukrainian attack. Similarly, we have VDV forces behind Bakhmut, an entire division. There are also similar sized forces of division each in Luhansk area, in Donbas area, south of Vuhledar and south of Orikhiv. They are all free to maneuver. So if the Ukrainians penetrate the first line of the front line, within hours they are going to be confronted with heavy Russian, with counterattacks by heavy Russian mechanized forces from the depth, with lots of artillery and with heavy air support. This is not ideal for Ukraine to tackle. Here you need, as I said, lots of more artillery. Ukraine needs lots of more artillery and lots of more air defenses just for the start, because you have to protect your own troops from enemy air power and enemy artillery. You have even air defense systems which are capable of intercepting such weapons, like, for example, Uragan, or these new glide bombs, which the Russian Air Force is deploying since for something like 2 months now. So there is lots of more with Ukraine, lots of more weaponry, especially lots of more ammunition which Ukraine needs in order to run such an operation. This is something I'm talking about since 1 year, but this is not going to change even in 5 years from now. This is how a war of this size and intensity is fought. It's not working any other way.
Today, nobody's know exactly how much troops Ukraine have for counteroffensive. But in so-called Pentagon leaks, we saw information about 12 trained Ukrainian brigades that we will lead in their counteroffensive. And together with our counteroffensive guard, and volunteers is about 120,000 soldiers. Is it enough if, for example, Russia have 430,000 soldiers in Ukraine?
Well, we have to be cautious here, not jump to conclusions. For example, the Pentagon papers actually superimposing this build-up of 12 Ukrainian new brigades, which are equipped with Western weaponry, delivered over the last 3 months. But it doesn't mean that these units are going to lead the counteroffensive. So this is first thing, which we shouldn't automatically conclude. Let's say it this way. If you are, if you are a cynical general, you say, okay, you are sending your fresh units into attack because they are more likely to attack with more enthusiasm, because they are inexperienced and they do not know what can happen to them. A unit of hardcore professionals, veterans, is not going to attack as enthusiastically, as a fresh unit, as an inexperienced unit. But matter of fact is that Ukrainian armed forces cannot afford such, excuse me for expression, idiotic officers or commanders anymore. We've seen what kind of critic is the ZSU facing as soon as it makes major mistakes, like deploying an inexperienced unit into the first front line in Soledar back in January, where the unit de facto turned around and ran away at the first sign of trouble. So this is unlikely to happen in that sense. What is more likely to happen is the following. Simultaneously with these 12 newly organized or established brigades, Ukraine has equipped, these are 12 units equipped with Western weapons. Ukraine has established at least a similar number of other units as well. And they are equipped partially with equipment or armament captured from the Russians, and partially with tanks and other weaponry from own stocks, but repaired and overhauled ever since. So you have actually a total of some 24 new brigades. And for these units equipped with, this is foremost valid for units of the assault guard. So now some of these units are going to participate in that counteroffensive, but many others not. This is now depending on selection by the general staff and local commanders. This unit is good enough, this unit is fit, this unit is ready, this unit lacks this and that kind of training, other unit lacks ammunition or specific equipment. Okay, it's not fit for combat, and so on and so on. In other cases, we are going to see lots of experienced formations running attacks, because formations like, sorry, I cannot help it, but 92nd, 93rd Mechanized Brigades, I mean, what they are doing to the Russians already since 24th of February last year is marvelous. You see them excelling at every opportunity and causing really heavy casualties to the Russian army, because in particular 92nd, 93rd, perhaps the 3rd Assault Brigade and so on, they are the units which are really literally killing most of Russian troops. They're killing them by thousands. We have, of course, also 53rd, which is motorized or mechanized brigade. We have 128 mountain assault brigade and so on and so on. Excellent units, but you don't hear about them right now. Why? Because they are preparing for the offensive. We have the 1st Tank Brigade, which did such a great job in the Chernihiv area the first 2 months of the war. You don't hear about it right now. Why? Because it's also preparing. So it is such formations we have to expect to be at the brunt of this, any kind of counteroffensive. And finally, we have to keep the following in mind. Expecting that the Ukrainians, now, let's say, they're going to counterattack in Vuhledar area. Let's say this is not going to happen, but let's say they would attack in Vuhledar area. Expecting that then, excuse me, President Zelensky good. 1 or 2 hours later, appear on the TV and say, we are counter-attacking, launching a big offensive in Vuhledar area, forget it. That's not going to happen. What is much more likely to happen is that Ukraine is going to attack on plenty of different positions at the same time, and then see what happens. Where is it making best advances? How are the Russians reacting? And with help of NATO reconnaissance, they're going to monitor the reaction of Russian reserves behind the front line. Here it is important to think about the following. When you look at the map of Ukraine, you see the front lines, something in a semicircle. Here is Ukraine, here are the Russians, okay? This means that Ukraine has the advantage of the inner line. Inner line is always shorter than the outer line.
I see.
That means that Ukrainians have it easier to move troops from one point of the front line to the other. Russians have to do so, over Russia to Belarus and then down to Rostov-na-Don and so on. But Ukrainians can do so from the inside. This is the point. This is what is going to play a very important role. This can also be used very well to deceive the Russians, to cause them to make mistakes. For example, Ukraine says, okay, let's concentrate 5 brigades in Vuhledar area. Russians, they recognize us, it identifies, Ukrainians have 5 brigades in Vuhledar area. Well, they send their reinforcements, for example, up there from, is it Luhansk or wherever, down to Vuhledar. Ukrainians then attack somewhere else, and so on. There's going to be lots of such trickery, which is why whenever some kind of a counteroffensive takes place, it could be now, it's not going to be now, but let's say in 15 days or in 50 days or in 5 months, there's going to be lots of confusion early on, lots of claims and lots of exaggerations and so on and so on. It's going to take something like 1 week at least to clear up and to find out, okay, Ukrainians are actually focusing their attention on this area and trying to breach through here, or have even broken through and they are advancing in this direction.
Tom, a few days ago you wrote an article, name of this article, why is NATO not delivering Western design fighter jet to Ukraine? You say that you explain this many times, but nevertheless, this question is quite important for Ukrainians, especially before the counteroffensive, That is why let's speak about that once more. And the main questions for Ukrainians is why our allies not supply us modern military jet.
Whatever happens on the world, our Western governments are first thinking about economy. So if there is a pandemic, they first think how to save the economy. If there is a war, they first think what kind of effects is this going to have up on our economy and how to save this economy. So for us, the priority for our governments, priority is always the economy. Therefore, when they supply Ukraine, when there is a war in Ukraine, and they are supplying Ukraine, whether with money or with weapons or supplies or ammunition, whatever, they're always first thinking what are the effects upon their own economy. Can our economy support provision of aid to Ukraine? Is it sustainable? And so on and so on. And of course, how much profit do the people who are financing them are making through provision of aid, of support for Ukraine? So, and this is how it works. And when one goes along that line, then delivery of fighter bombers to Ukraine is simply making absolutely no sense from the Western point of view. And this is what I was trying to explain in that article. From the Western point of view, it's never going to happen, or at least not very soon. From Ukrainian point of view, of course, the situation is entirely different. You are fighting a war for your survival, after all. Because if the Russians overrun you, I don't want to think what's going to happen to people like you, for example, Lyudmila. Not to talk about plenty of your viewers. you're going to disappear de facto. Nobody's going to hear from you for the next 20 years if you survive at all. And if it becomes known what has happened to you and so on and so on. We have seen this in plenty of captured areas, parts of Ukraine, the first months of the war. In Kherson, early days, there were the protests and so on and so on. There was civil resistance. And over the time, the Russians suppressed this, to the level where nobody trusted that they are going outside. People were arrested, tortured, detained, disappeared. We have seen this in Izium, not to talk about northwestern Kiev, and so on and so on. So it is, you are seeing this war entirely differently than the West. You are seeing, you're monitoring or feeling the situation. We need this. We need fighter bombers right now. There is no reason to delay this, to deny this, or something else. The West sees it entirely differently. The West sees, okay, Ukrainians have, with a little bit what we have supplied to them, they have stopped the Russians, they have caused them heavy losses, they have destroyed the Russian regular armed forces. And with a little bit more, they have run 2 successful counteroffensives. Well, everything is fine from our point of view. Now let's talk about the ceasefire. This is the way the Western politicians think. Why the ceasefire? Because the sooner the war stops, on one side, the sooner certain of our elites, or let's call them what they are, oligarchy, because we have the same oligarchy like you in Ukraine, are going to be able to get back to business as usual with Putin or whoever else around the world, on one side. On the other side, because the sooner the politicians can be in a position to refocus on what really matters to them. And this is not Ukraine. I'm sorry for it to express it that bluntly, but this is not Ukraine. So everything that is happening in between is, Zelensky is coming to visit London, Paris, Berlin, whatever, Helsinki. Oh, great, let's do some PR, This is good for public relations because Zelensky is so popular between the youngsters. So let's take a few photographs with him and show him the places, and everything is fine. And my standing in the public is going to be better. But other than this, it's always the same. Oh, we are doing so much for Ukraine, blah, 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 but actually doing very little. Far from what is at least theoretically possible. And as long as this is that way, and right now I do not see why should this change, this is going to remain that way. You're going to receive only what is absolutely necessary, and other things you have to wait for.
Tom, you is a military analyst especially in military aviation, yeah, and you know many histories about different wars all over the world. What do you think? Is it really possible to have effective offensive without military aircraft, without military aircraft, with modern military aircrafts? Because Russia, for example, you know about that Russia have some modern aircrafts, and it has about maybe 500 such military aircrafts.
Yes, it very much is, and this is what I'm explaining this. There was, I think, the first TV interview with me in Ukrainian media was back sometimes in early March last year. And I remember this interview very well because I promptly explained, look, you need lots of firepower, conventional firepower, combined with mobile air defenses. Why do you need that? Because you need lots of conventional firepower, lots of high explosives in order to destroy Russian army. And you did that last summer. We have seen this happening. So what is necessary here? You need this combination of artillery, and again, I'm not talking only about artillery pieces in terms of classic artillery, guns shooting, but also this long-range artillery rockets with range of 70 to 130 kilometers. This is the combination you need, and you need lots of this. And I'm really talking about dozens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of shells and thousands of artillery rockets. Why? Because this is the only way to guarantee that you can penetrate, to breach the enemy front lines block the enemy reserves with your artillery fire, destroy the enemy artillery, so to prevent it from destroying your advancing forces, and prevent you from advancing deep into the enemy controlled territory. At the same time, in order to prevent the Russian Air Force from striking your ground troops, your advancing ground troops, you need air defense system. You have an integrated air defense system covering most of Ukraine, most of the big cities, most of major industrial centers and so on. This is meanwhile intact and bolstered by the deliveries of Patriots, of NASAMS, of Iris-T and so on. But this is not enough. Right now you still don't have enough air defenses to travel with your ground forces as they advance into the Russian-controlled territory and offer them protection. And because you've asked if there are parallels to any earlier war, look what the Egyptians have done in 1973, in October 73. They have done exactly that. They have overpowered the Bar-Lev line along the Suez Canal, crossed the Suez Canal with their infantry, then built the pontoon bridges and followed that by armor. And all the while moving their troops over the Suez Canal, they were covering these troops, the movement, with their mobile air defense systems. So, which meant that when the Israelis came in with their air force to strike the pontoon bridges and Egyptian infantry and Egyptian artillery, they were hit by air defense missiles. And they suffered heavy losses in aircraft. With other words, they couldn't destroy the advancing Egyptian forces, and because of this, the advancing Egyptian forces were capable to continue their advance to a specific limit, to the outer limits of that air defense system, and then they entrenched. And this is what they have achieved. In their case, such a shallow advance of some 10 to 12 kilometers was perfectly enough to force the Israelis into negotiations, into serious negotiations. In your case, in the case of Ukraine, you need much more than that. You need to advance 200, 300 kilometers in certain areas. You need to advance, you know better than I do, how densely populated is eastern Ukraine. You need to advance not into empty desert of the Sinai, but you need to advance into densely populated urban areas of Luhansk, of Donetsk, of Mariupol. This is an entirely different pair of shoes. This is why it takes so much more air defense systems, why it takes so much more artillery, why it takes so much more preparations, ammunition, supplies, so much more training from your troops, so many more brigades, and so on and so on. So it's a entirely different situation. It is more reminiscent of different big battles on the so-called Eastern Front of the World War II than any kind of modern wars, because most of modern wars are actually relatively small in comparison.
At the beginning of this big war, the Russian aviation have a domination on the battlefield for other reasons. Yeah, I wonder, but nevertheless, it was.
You know, Ukrainian air defense was in peacetime condition, which means it wasn't powered up. And once the Russians have invaded last year on 24th, there was the question, you know, how long would it take for Ukrainian air defense systems to connect itself with each other, different units, and then to power up their systems. And this took some 3 or 4 days. And during this first 3 or 4 days, before this air defense system was integrated and powered up, the Russians could do whatever they like. They were really flying all the way to Kiev with their fighter bombers and bombing and even trying to hit specific units of Ukrainian air defense system while they were still in their garrisons, in their barracks. This is what was going on. So yes, they were de facto free to do whatever they like. At least when it comes to heavy Ukrainian air defense systems, like S-300, like Buk, like even lighter ones like OSA AK, or like Strela 10. But when it came then to lighter air defense systems, we have seen what has happened as this big helicopter formation came down the Dnipro and in the direction of Kiev and then turned over across the river in direction of Hostomel. there was just this one small group of man-pad operators, and they shot down 4 or 5 helicopters on the spot. So it wasn't that easy, you know. We have seen the similar situation in Voznetsensk, where the Russians rushed a similar heliborne operation from, I think, from the Nova Kakhovka area via Bashtanka to Voznetsensk. And by sheer luck, they were stupid to fly over Bashtanka, because in Bashtanka there was a part of a certain Ukrainian brigade, and this was well equipped with manpads. So when the helicopters, you know, passed by their position, they shot down one after the other, some 4 helicopters or something like that. So it was, the Russians were free, you know, to run specific kind of operations, but they were not entirely unmolested. And on the other side, there was also the problem with Ukrainian Air Force. You know, when you start such fighting a war under such conditions, you're flying MiG-29s and Su-27s, you need lots of ground support. You need, you know, your ground control to tell you where is the enemy, so you can fly in proper direction in order to intercept him, because you are moving at very high speeds and have a limited amount of fuel on board your aircraft. If you are sent in the wrong direction, you are ending somewhere where there is no enemy and have no fuel. You have to return back to base, and that's it. For the next 2 hours, you are out of the war. And then you have to start everything again. So this is why it's important to have good ground control. And the ground control was depending on the Ukrainian air defense system, and this was not yet powered up. So the ground control was imperfect, and what happened was that Ukraine has lost quite a lot of fighter jets and fighter pilots, especially older experienced fighter pilots, in the first few days of the war, without achieving anything, or at least not much in return. Perhaps one Su-25 was shot down, one Russia's Su-25. So, and you say the Russians had no control because they're not searching for control of the air. They're searching for dominance over the front line. And if their front line is, for example, 20 kilometers north of Kiev, then they're searching for aerial dominance 20 kilometers north of Kiev, and not 100 kilometers south of Kiev, where the MiG-29s or Su-27s were based. You know, so this is the difference. In the West, you always think, well, if you want dominance and want to go in direction of aerial superiority, then you have to dominate not only the front line, but also 200, 500 kilometers behind the front line. The Russians do not think that way. They think, no, okay, I need the aerial dominance over the front line. I don't need air superiority, but I need, you know, it's enough if my fighters can advance to the front line and shell or bomb enemy positions. But I'm perfectly happy with this, and this is what they're doing. This is how the Air Force Russian Air Force is fighting this war all the time. It's even now so, you know. They do not try to penetrate the Ukrainian airspace with their aircraft. What they do, they have developed these glide bombs. So now they are operating like this: 12,000 meters high, 1,000 kilometers per hour, Su-34, equipped with two such glide bombs. So when you come at 1,000 kilometers per hour in 12 kilometers altitude, and release your bombs, they're flying 60 kilometers far, thanks to their wings. They flip out wings, and they're flying like this, and you know they can hit the target 60 kilometers away. It means that your fighter, your aircraft, does not even need to fly into the enemy-controlled airspace, into Ukrainian controlled airspace. It just approaches close enough to release this bomb and hit the target. That's it. You don't need more. Why should they now, you know, try to wrestle the control of Ukrainian airspace from Ukrainian Air Force and Air Defense Force, if this is perfectly enough to enable them to hit targets on the ground? This is how the Russians are fighting wars.
Tom, it was very interesting discussion under your link, to your article, and let me quote it one of the comment. Yeah. It seems to me it's not a matter of domination in sky over Russia, and it is about not let them, means Russia, dominated our battlefield. Last month, they means Russians there, knocked down a lot of Ukrainian air defense system. Without F-16 covering troops during counterattack, I can imagine what will happen to them. It is just a comment, yeah? And the question is, how to prevent Russia aviation from dominated and the battlefield. What Ukraine, what possibilities have Ukraine right now? Again and again.
No problem. Firstly, there is a set. You need a mobile integrated air defense system. What does it mean? You need a system which is including several mobile radars, which means radars which you can, put on a sort of trolley, towed by a truck, lay down on the ground, turn on, and 5 minutes later you have the radar picture around your position. It's as simple as that in some cases. And there are such systems, although I think there are not enough of them in Ukraine. So you need such radars for the start. Then you need a similar air defense systems. This is like IRIS-T or NASAMS, which you can also move in similar fashion. Your troops have all the time, your air defenses have to travel with your troops. If your troops are attacking some area, air defenses have to move forward to provide better protection. And what is very important but very often overseen, you need lots of electronic warfare systems. You need systems which are jamming GLONASS, positioning system. You need systems which are jamming GPS, which means that in that case, if they are jamming GPS, you cannot fire your GPS guided ammunition. So you're depending on your artillery, on classic artillery, which is not guided, for a while operating your GPS jammers, and so on. So you need a combination of different systems, each of them serving another purpose. And without this, you cannot advance. Your troops are, as soon as they advance, they are exposed to enemy counter-strikes and you are in trouble. You are never going to, we have to completely write off, this is never going to happen, that you can entirely stop Russians, prevent them from striking back at your advancing forces. This is always going to happen. If nothing else, they're going to send 10 aircraft, you shot down 5, and the other 5 are still bombing and still causing casualties and problems. So this is pointless to even try. You need a mobile integrated air defense system which can travel with your forces, and you need similar mobile electronic warfare systems and so on. And unless you really have this, and I hope you are in the process of getting it, I do not see such an operation having lots of outlooks for a serious advance. You may be able to dent the front line to some 5 to 10 kilometers, but that's it, and it is going to cost horrendous losses. Alone because your artillery is not going to be able to overpower the Russian artillery, because the Russian Air Force is going to hit your artillery. It's as simple as that.
Tom, thank you very much. And the last question, do you have any prediction for the start of Ukrainian counteroffensive?
As always, I'm not making any kind of predictions. It depends on lots of factors which are currently unclear. Foremost, the speed with which the NATO is delivering shells to Ukraine. It depends on the weather. Is the weather now going to clear and to dry? And if it dries, how long? Because we have seen, was it 2 weeks ago, it started drying, but then came another wave of rains and so on. It depends also on the politics after all. If the Ukrainian public is exercising too much pressure upon Zelensky to do something, he's going to do similar nonsense like all the NATO last year and do something in terms of sending 10 tanks, 15 armored personnel carriers, 1 air defense system, 1 this, 20 of that, and so on, which is nothing in long term. Ukrainian public must accept that now it has to be patient and wait for the right moment to come. And it's going to come sooner or later. Just don't rush. If you rush, you're just going to suffer losses. This is not going to help anybody.
Tom, thank you very much. Thank you to be with us today. Thank you.
You're most welcome. Thank you very much as well.
Thank you.